The Center for Migration Studies of New York commissioned over 20 papers on different aspects of the refugee protection system by leading scholars for a CMS conference and special collection of the Journal on Migration and Human Security entitled Rethinking the Global Refugee Protection System. In this video, Bill Frelick, director of the Refugee Program at Human Rights Watch, discusses the CMS conference and his paper, The Impact of Externalization of Migration Controls on the Rights of Asylum Seekers and Other Migrants. The paper is co-authored with Ian Keisel from the University of Oxford and Jennifer Podko from Kids in Need of Defense.
They go back to some fundamental questions. The question of the principle of non-refoulement, the basic protection of people to be able to flee their countries when their lives are threatened. And I think that principle is at great risk, both for people who are seeking to leave active threats to their lives in Syria, for example. I mean, each of the major borders, with all due respect to the great job of nearly 5 million refugees that have been hosted so far, there are twice as many internally displaced people inside Syria. We don't know a whole lot about their situation, but what we do know is that about 70,000 people are massed on the Jordanian border as we speak, that are in a place where they can't get basic humanitarian assistance to come to them, and they're trying to save themselves basically and seek basic principles of asylum, and they're being stuck basically in this desert area. On the Turkish border, there are at least that number of people, if not twice that number of people, that are basically stuck there as well on the Syrian side. And the Turkish border guards have been shooting people, and we've documented that they've shot and killed people seeking to cross that border. And Turkey has imposed visa restrictions for people that are Syrians, no longer permitted to arrive by air. So legal means of crossing are few and far between. And Lebanon has also imposed visa restrictions, and basically you need, in order to cross there, you need to have vulnerability in addition to your refugee claims to get you into Lebanon at this point. And this represents, I don't want to just point the finger at these countries that are the neighboring states that are already overburdened by this enormous refugee presence. In the case of Lebanon, with very few resources, more than 1 million people in a country that's very small, about more than a quarter of its population probably at this point. But it has been a failure of the international community to provide support, and it's part of the impetus for the September high-level meetings to try to garner more support for those countries of first arrival. The problem, as I see it, is that oftentimes a nominal improvement is enough to basically sign off and essentially say, okay, people are safe. They're safe in some safe zone internally. They're safe in the country of first arrival, and we can wash our hands of any further responsibility. And so I'm fearful of sort of maximalist rhetoric with minimalist response, and using that as a pretext to basically prevent people from actually seeking asylum and coming to safety. Well, I actually think it's been happening for a long time. In the paper that we've written, we actually trace the U.S. externalization of migration controls back to the early 1980s, back to the Reagan administration, with the beginnings of the interdiction of Haitian migrants and asylum seekers and summarily returning them to Haiti. In the case of the European Union, this goes back to what was called the New Vision proposals in 2003. And Australia has been doing this for quite some time as well. And of course, all of these countries and regions of destination learn from each other, and the playbook develops as they develop ever more sophisticated ways of deflecting migration flows and stemming them, in fact, with some success. I mean, some of these deterrent strategies have worked pretty well. In the case of Australia, for example, they have largely succeeded in preventing irregular maritime asylum seekers from hitting their shores, and even when they have hit their shores, they've excised from their domestic law, physical territories that are part of Australia to make them for refugee law purposes external to the country. So even externalization isn't just a physical externalization, it's actually using certain legal manipulations and fictions to create safe zones in airports and transit zones, as we see in Hungary right now, on Hungarian territory, but basically saying people in these zones don't have any rights. And the US, of course, really led the charge on this with Guantanamo, using it as essentially a rights-free zone where they could hold both Cubans and Haitians, pending their return to Haiti. Of course, in the case of Cubans, return to Cuba was not an option. But at this point, Guantanamo is still being used by the Obama administration. It started with the first Bush administration and has been sort of up and down and back and forth. But basically, the model is that Haitians will be interdicted by the Coast Guard. They'll be brought, if they pass a cursory screening aboard the Coast Guard cutter, and most of them won't, they'll just be sent right back. They'll be taken to Guantanamo, where they won't have rights to lawyers. They won't have judicial review, nothing of the sort. They'll have the basic bare minimum. If they somehow are able to establish a refugee claim, then they have to wait for a third country to which they could be resettled through some bilateral agreement with the United States in that third country, UNHCR not being involved in that at all. And so it's using resettlement as sort of a tool of a migration enforcement mechanism, as opposed to using resettlement as a humanitarian solution for refugees. So there's a lot that's really problematic here, and using refugee principles and using humanitarian rhetoric. We want to prevent people from taking dangerous journeys. Well, what's the alternative? I mean, if somebody's exercising their human right to flee persecution, to flee war, to flee for their lives, they're willing to take some risks to do that. And who are we to say that that they shouldn't take those risks, and for humanitarian reasons we're going to prevent you from fleeing? But a lot of the safe alternatives, when you look at them closely, are less than what they appear to be. The Central American Migration Program for in-country processing for Central American children is something that maybe at first glance looks like it would be a safe and orderly alternative to a dangerous journey through Mexico. However, in order to qualify for it, one, you need to have a parent that's legally present in the United States and petitions on your behalf. DNA testing, it takes a year or so to go through multiple interviews, multiple procedures to see whether you even qualify at all. But the big catch-22 in all this is that you have to qualify as having a well-founded fear of being persecuted, that you qualify as a refugee, but you have to do that while staying within the country where you fear persecution. And it's an utter contradiction. If you're really fearing for your life, then you're going to get the hell out of there. You're going to flee, and there's no mechanism for taking that child who flees El Salvador and goes to a neighboring country to be able to be resettled to the United States. This program requires you to stay in the very place where you're being persecuted and puts your life at greater risk through this program. So the supposed safe and orderly mechanism that is supposed to make you more protected from taking a dangerous journey is actually telling you to stay in the place where your persecutors are seeking to kill you, to wait for this safe and orderly mechanism. It's really absurd on its face. And it's no surprise that it's taken well over a year to resettle even a handful of people. And now those that they've sort of made the turn and are resettling more through this program, most of them are actually not even qualifying for the program, and they're getting what's called paroled in. Essentially, it looks like a family reunification program. It could be a perfectly good immigration program, but without immigration benefits because it's only parole. And it's not really a refugee program to protect people because the real refugees have to flee the threats to their lives, and they're not protected by this at all. So the problem here is that we have a lot of humanitarian rhetoric. We have a lot of rhetoric that I think is used to mask efforts to prevent refugees who flee chaos. That's what the refugee reality is. It's war, it's conflict, it's somebody out to kill you. You don't have time to get all your papers in order. And we are trying to manage this and make it orderly and make it something that is immigration friendly. And you just can't fit this round peg into this square hole necessarily. I'm motivated not through some charitable instinct. I'm motivated by a sense of injustice, by feeling that people who are vulnerable are being dismissed, are being harmed by people who are in power, being exploited. And I am fortunate enough to be, through the happenstance of my birth and good fortune, to be in a position where I might be able to do something to speak on their behalf and to help to right injustices. But fundamentally, Human Rights Watch, the organization I work for, we're not a humanitarian organization. We're a human rights organization. We want to go after the bad guys. We want to see people that commit crimes against humanity held accountable for their crimes. We want them to be prosecuted. We're tough. We mean business. And I love the humanitarians. I think they're sweet and great, and they do great and wonderful work. But I ain't one of them. I'm a fighter, and I want to fight injustice, and I want to battle with those in power who need to be held account for their actions.